I wanted to welcome everyone and say if you're interested, you can introduce yourself in the chat function. Also, if you have Q&As today, any questions, put them in the Q&A box. That way, if I don't get to them during this presentation, I can get to them afterwards and I will respond to all questions. We will be recording this and hopefully you're seeing closed captions. Those are available. If for any reason you miss anything or you want to share it with anyone, this will be sent out tomorrow, the recording. So, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to talk a little bit about Workvision Consulting before we dive into pay equity and pay equity audits today. So our services, we are a boutique human resources consulting company. And we have three main buckets that our services fall under. We do diversity, equity, and inclusion audits. So some of the things that might happen during those audits are climate assessments, surveys, interviews, and reviews of processes and procedures. The next bucket is diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And then last, we have pay equity audits, which is what we're going to talk about today. With all of these buckets of services, we do really tailor them to our clients. So if there's something specific that you're hoping to have help with in the human resources arena, focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, looking at it from that lens, please reach out because there are very specific things that we can do within these three buckets. So for example, right now, I'm working with a client on their performance reviews, revamping that process and looking at it through a DE&I lens. Another thing I'm doing right now is working on revamping a hiring process and job descriptions along with that. And again, just always looking at that DE&I lens. And Workvision Consulting, you can connect with us online. So our website is workvisionconsulting.com. You can reach out at info@workvisionconsulting.com. We also have on our website, there is a contact form. So if you do want to fill that out to possibly ask about a consultation, we do free consultations to talk about any services. And then you can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So we are going to get started talking about pay equity audits. She works hard for the money, how to conduct a pay equity audit and make systemic changes in your organization. Now, just for a moment, I am going to stop sharing my screen and we are going to do a poll. Really interesting results. So we're seeing that either people right now are doing nothing and they're excited to learn more, or they don't know what their company is doing. So nobody really with a loose structure or even a very structured structure. So thank you for participating in that. The things that we are going to talk about today with pay equity and pay equity audits, we're going to start by going over some definitions, get everybody on the same page, understanding what we mean when we say certain things around pay equity. Then we'll talk about some laws and trends in pay equity. And then lastly, we'll walk through how to conduct an audit. So let's start with some definitions. We have two things we hear about a lot when talking about pay equity. One is the pay gap, and the other is equal pay for equal work. And sometimes these do get used interchangeably, but they are two different things. And so I want to talk about what each of them are. So the pay gap is the difference between the average pay of two different groups of people. Most commonly, we hear about this as the gender pay gap. But we do more frequently talk about the racial pay gap and then the intersectionality between those two. So we look at things like how does race and gender impact pay? But there's many other things we could talk about with pay gap. We could talk about able-bodied people, we could talk about sexuality, all the different things that might impact discrimination within our country could impact gaps in people's pay. So with the pay gap, In 2018, according to the US Census Bureau, when we look at the gender pay gap of men and women, not accounting for any other factors, the women were making 81.6 cents on the dollar compared to what men are making. And that's in the United States and based on an average. So with the pay gap, we're not looking at the jobs. So we're not comparing job for job, we're just comparing general averages. Then when you look at race in that, and you look at the intersectionality between race and gender, Black women in 2018 were making 66 cents for every dollar that white men were making, and Hispanic women even less, 58 cents for every dollar that white men were making. Then let's talk about equal pay for equal work. So this is most commonly what we're looking at and what we hear about when we are talking about equal pay laws. And so laws often don't look at the pay gap discrepancy, they look at equal pay for equal work. So actually comparing if a man and a woman are doing the same job or similar work, are they paid equally? And this is one thing where you'll hear people say the pay gap is a myth, because they say that it doesn't compare equal pay for equal work, which is true. However, it's still important to think about the pay gap because of the opportunity gap and the fact that there is overall systemic inequalities in our country that result in the pay gap and result in why people don't have the opportunities to do certain jobs that might pay them higher. Some examples of factors in the opportunity gap are that we have closed referral networks oftentimes. So there are certain jobs that pretty much only get filled on referral, and people tend to refer people who look like themselves. And so those jobs tend to be filled by the same demographics of people. You'll have people who are, pay equity truthers or pay equity deniers, and they'll say the pay gap doesn't exist. However, when we look at equal pay for equal work, and this is based on a study done by PayScale from 2019 data, there's still a 2% difference when we look just at men and women. So when we compare men and women doing the same jobs, women are making 98 cents for every dollar that a man makes. And that's a much better number than the pay gap. However, it's still problematic. I think we can still say that's not right. It should be $1 for every dollar. The other thing, when we talk about equal pay for equal work and we look at these laws, most of the time they're focusing on gender, like I mentioned, and they're also focusing on the gender binary. So we don't see a lot of talk about non-binary folks when we look at both the data and the laws and how they protect people. Although I will talk a little bit about the more recent Supreme Court ruling that does protect people based on gender identity and sexual orientation. So there are some changes in that, but we still have a long ways to go in those laws. The other thing I want to talk about is adverse impact. And so you might be wondering, well, how does adverse impact, play into talking about pay equity, pay gap, equal pay for equal work? Well, and you also might be wondering, what is adverse impact? So adverse impact is the unintentional repercussions caused by a specific practice within employment. We most often hear about adverse impact when it comes to hiring decisions, although it can impact any place in the employee life cycle. So that means, it could be promotions, it could be, we talked about hiring, training, terminations, anywhere across the life cycle. Now, still you might be wondering what it is. So I'll give you an example of adverse impact when it comes to hiring. An example of this is if you have a hiring manager who decides that they are not going to hire people who live in a certain neighborhood because they feel like the commute is too difficult and those people wouldn't be able to be on time for their jobs, or they might leave because the commute is too long for them. Now, this neighborhood within your city, it has a certain racial or ethnic makeup. And because this hiring manager has decided not to hire people from this neighborhood, that is having an adverse impact on that demographic of applicants from your applicant pool. So there's math that you can do to see if your hiring processes have an adverse impact. And although this isn't part of a lot of pay equity audits, I think it's a very important piece to look at when you're looking at your overall holistic structure and pay equity. So my push is to look beyond equal pay for equal work and look at your holistic system and how you might be having an adverse impact within that system. Now we're going to dive into pay equity history and laws. And this is a part I get really excited about. So hopefully it interests you as much as it interests me. But if not, bear with me. It's some really important stuff. The first one that I will talk about is the Equal Pay Act. And this first chunk of laws, they are all federal laws. So the important thing to note is that they impact anyone in the United States. And these are, the blanket laws, but then we'll go into how it impacts states and states having their own laws. With the Equal Pay Act, this made it illegal to pay men and women working in the same location different pay. And it was originally introduced in 1945 in Congress, but it failed. And it was almost 20 years later before it was actually put into effect, signed into law by President JFK. This law focuses solely on gender, and it doesn't fix the pay gap. It's really more focused on that equal pay for equal work. There's some things that I think are wrong with this act. One of them being that if an employee files a suit or a claim under the EPA, they have to prove that an employer willfully violated the law. This means that not only is the onus on the employee to prove their case, instead of the employer having to prove they didn't violate the law, it also has to be a willful violation, which means the employer had to know about it. And we know when it comes to discrimination, it's very easy to say that we didn't realize we were discriminating, or it was an accident, or it often, we know about unconscious bias, and often that's what's causing these problems and discrimination in things like pay. Next, I wanted to talk about the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. This one is, I think, a really interesting story. This bill was first signed into law in 2009 by President Obama, and it was actually the very first law that he signed in his presidency. The history behind this law is that Lilly Ledbetter in 1979 wanted to go get a job, and she was a mother and her husband was in the military, and against her husband's wishes, she went and got her dream job as a supervisor at Goodyear. Now, when she went and got this job, there were no other women working in supervisory roles. All the women were working in administration, and so all of her counterparts were male. Also, when she got this job, she was required to sign a contract that said she could not discuss her pay with any of her coworkers. Now, as an aside to this story, the National Labor Relations Act makes that illegal. So make sure that you don't have a culture of pay secrecy. You're not telling your employees that they can't talk about their pay, because that is considered protected concerted activity. But at this time, Goodyear got away with it, and they told their employees they couldn't talk about their pay. So Lilly Ledbetter worked at Goodyear for a long time until she retired. However, before she retired, she discovered that she was being paid far less than her male counterparts. So she filed a lawsuit. She filed under the EPA as well as Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And with this, she won the lawsuit. They said, yes, you were discriminated against, you were paid less. But then she lost on appeal. And this case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And it's really interesting because they weren't actually debating whether or not she was unfairly paid, because the answer was clear. She was discriminated against and paid less than her male counterparts. What they were debating was whether or not she had a claim. So her EPA claim was thrown out in one of the courts, but her Title VII claim was the one that made it all the way to the US Supreme Court. And what they were debating there was, because there was a 180-day limit to how long after the discrimination that she could file the claim, she had passed that limit. And what the debate was is, when does that 180 days start? Or, what's the latest it can start? So some people were saying, well, when she was initially paid a discriminatory wage is when that would start. Some people were saying when she found out or when she knew about it, that was sort of the major argument. And then other people were saying, actually, the last time she was paid, that last paycheck she received, that's when that 180 days should start. So every time you're paying her, it starts over. Now, the US Supreme Court did not vote in favor of Lilly Ledbetter. She lost her case. They had shown that she lost over $200,000 within her, about 20 years that she worked at Goodyear. And on top of that, lost out on things like retirement pay and, her pension, her Social Security. So it was quite a lot of money. But she never won that case. But what did happen was in 2009, when Obama signed this bill into law, it actually paved the way for people in the future filing claims. So what it did is it now allows individuals to file charges of alleged pay discrimination under both Title VII, the Age Discrimination Act, as well as the American with Disabilities Act. And that 180-day period starts after the last paycheck. So a big piece of this too was that Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a scathing dissent when this ruling was administered by the US Supreme Court. And she said that she felt like it should start after that last paycheck. So one of the reasons this is so important to think about as you're thinking about how your pay is administered within your organization is that if you're paying someone wrong, it's going to start over from when they could file a claim every time you pay them. And that's why this work of doing pay equity audits is so very important, because you want to remedy any unfair pay, and also doing pay equity audits regularly. So you don't just want to do it one time and then think, okay, we're good forever, because pay can change over time and there can be new hiring decisions and your pay may be inequitable in the future. The other laws I just wanted to briefly mention, and this is a lot of text, so I won't read it all to you, but essentially I talked about Title VII, which is one of the ways that people can file claims. And this covers race, color, religion, gender, pregnancy, and national origin. The Supreme Court ruling that I talked about a little earlier was that gender is now considered to also encompass gender identity and sexual orientation. So those are covered under Title VII as well. And then the Age Discrimination Employment Act, that covers, protects employees who are 40 years of age or older. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act protects individuals with disabilities. And so all of those are ways that people can file claims of unfair pay. So what is next? Like, what are we seeing, and what are some of the specific state laws that you have to keep in mind? Now, state pay laws are very important because every state except for Mississippi and Alabama have their own laws around discrimination or equal pay. So you really have to look at your state law, and if you're a company that does business in multiple states, understanding all of the state laws, making sure you're compliant. And my push to people is really to look at these three laws, which are California, Colorado, and New York. And I'm going to talk in more detail about these three states because they have some of the more progressive laws. And it's really the trends that we're seeing in pay and pay equity are following some of these laws and the pay practices. And so following some of these laws, what the states are doing is going to help you attract the top talent and also just create a more equitable system for your employees. So California California had an Equal Pay Act before the Federal Act, and that was in 1949 that California had their own Equal Pay Act. But one of the things that was really big in California was in 2015 when Governor Jerry Brown signed the Fair Pay Act, which strengthened the Equal Pay Act. Now, the Fair Pay Act is updated pretty much every year. And so if you're in California, it's really important to keep up to date with the changes that are happening. But I'll talk about some of the major things that the Fair Pay Act added to the Equal Pay Act and why it's so important to continue to look at this as we're looking at trends in pay equity. So one of the things that the Fair Pay Act added was, or actually eliminated, was that it eliminated the requirement for employees to be compared in the same establishment. It also added race and ethnicity-based wage differences. So it expanded on that gender discrimination and added some other things. And then another big one, and this is something we're seeing across many states, is that in the state of California and many other states as well, you're not allowed to ask for an applicant's salary history or base any future pay decisions on salary history. The reason for this is when looking at salary history, we see that that continues the discrimination into the future. So that's a way of eliminating discrimination. If someone was paid less when they initially entered the workforce, instead of paying them based on what your job is worth, you're paying them based on what you feel like they are worth. And California and many people in talking about pay equity really believe that people should be paid based on what the job they're doing is worth instead of based on who they are and what they were paid before. The other thing that's a really big deal is that if an employer is asked by an applicant who has been through a first round interview what the pay for the job they're interviewing for is, that employer must provide the pay. So they either have to provide a pay rate, a salary, or a pay scale. So maybe a range of an hourly rate or a salary. So this is, I'll talk a little bit later about pay scales and pay grades, but this is a really important reason to have this stuff set out, because if an applicant asks, then you can share it without having to scramble and figure out what are we trying to pay for this job. Next is the Colorado law, and this is the newest law. It's really an exciting progressive law. Previously, California had always been the most progressive when it came to pay equity, but now Colorado has beat out California. So I'll talk about, a lot of the things I mentioned that California does, Colorado is doing as well, but they have some additional pieces to their pay equity law. So this pay equity law was effective January 1st of this year. And the goal of it is to increase both equity, but also transparency. And this is the only law in the country that encourages companies to do regular self-audits, so a pay equity audit as part of their compensation practice. Some of the other things that this job does is it requires employers to post available jobs to their employees, their internal postings. It also requires that for internal and external postings, when there's a job opening, that an employer must disclose the hourly wage or salary on that posting. And so that's a little different. In California, it doesn't have to be disclosed until an applicant asks. However, in Colorado, it has to be disclosed to everyone on that posting. So that's an important difference. And I think we'll see that California will go in that direction eventually. The other thing is that it requires descriptions of the benefits too, because one of the things we talk about with pay equity is we can't just look at the salary or hourly wage, we have to look at total compensation. And the other thing is if there's additional comp offered. So if there are bonuses, that must be listed. If there's a commission structure, equity, things like that. And what we're really seeing with the trends of pay equity is this is what people are asking for. So they really want to see what they're going to be paid before they're even applying for jobs sometimes. And I see that as a trend when I talk to people who are job searching, or in groups that are focused on hiring, that sometimes applicants won't apply for jobs if they don't know what that range is going to be. Lastly, I'll talk about New York. New York State gets the award for being the most complicated as far as having the most number of laws. So they have their own state law, and just like many of the other laws, that protects against pay discrimination in many categories and also provides damages for liability for damages, so payout from employers. But another thing that we see in New York, which is similar to some of the other states, is a ban on asking about applicant salary history. And we see this in New York City, Albany County, Suffolk County, and Westchester County. So let's get into the pay equity audit. This is the checklist for the pay equity audit, and I'll go over it and then we'll go into some detail. This is available in a PDF form. You can find that either by going to the workvisionconsulting.com website under resources, but also I will send out a link that'll be included with this recording if you want to get that PDF version, and it has a little bit more information as well. So that's a printable PDF if you're interested in that. The steps for completing this audit, number one is getting your leadership on board. So this can be a challenge sometimes. They don't want to do the work or spend the money to do this type of audit, but it is really important, as you've seen from all the laws that are in place. And the thing with this is, sometimes leadership might be pushing you to do this, and that's great, but sometimes it might take a while. And I'm going to talk about some strategies for convincing your leadership. The next thing is setting your pay strategy. Then you will have to get market data, create compensation bands. Some companies may not have exact bands. They might have exact pay depending on how the job works, but we'll talk about that. You got to collect all of your company data and then compare that data to your compensation bands that you've created. And then the last piece is proposing pay adjustments to leadership. And not only is this pay adjustments, but you also might have adjustments to your practices. If you do an adverse action analysis of some of your practices and things relating to pay, that might be part of your proposal for changes to make. So, what are some of the things that you might talk about when you're trying to convince your leadership to do this work? Now, when I talk to people about how to convince their leadership to do different types of work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, I always say, think about the motivation of your management and your executive team. What is important to them? Everybody is different, so it's really getting to know your executives and understanding how to persuade them that this work is important and it aligns with what's important to them. And there's so many ways that equity in your systems, and in particular pay equity, actually do align with business objectives. But one of the things that is, to me, a really important argument for why this work is important is your people. So people, of course, are at the core of your business. And when you have inequitable systems, those people cannot thrive. I believe that when you take care of your people take care of your customers. And that's why doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work and pay equity audits is so very important. So, second step is to get into your pay strategy. And this sounds really simple, but it can be pretty complicated because there's a lot of pieces of strategy that you want to be thinking about. With your strategy, you want to think about why you pay the way you do and what is your goal of your pay plan. So when we talk about pay structure, we're really talking about, we have this structure and we want to maybe motivate people or we want to reward people for good performance. There's so many different things that that pay structure can do and represent, as part of your company, and it should align with your missions and values. Next, you want to think about the market. So we'll talk about data and market data and what kind of market data is the most valuable. But one thing you want to think about when you're comparing yourself to the market is, do you want to lead the market, meaning you want to be out ahead and more competitive than the average pay for your industry and positions? Do you want to lag the market? Maybe you're paying a little less, but you offer some other benefits like flexibility or work from home, some better benefits, health insurance, things like that. Or do you want to meet the market and kind of fall right in the middle in the average of where people in your industry are? And when you're thinking about this market data, there's going to be different types of markets. And so you may fall under a specific category. Perhaps you're a small business, but you know that you're mostly competing against medium-sized businesses for your talent. So that might change how you pay based on who you compete against for your talent. The next thing is transparency and where you fall on the transparency spectrum. And I'll talk about that next and what that means. And then total compensation. We talked about total compensation before. It's so important to look at when you're doing these audits because you may be paying equitably when it comes to your base pay or your hourly wages that you're paying employees. You may be equitable across the board. But what if you look at your benefits? Does it benefit a certain demographic within your company more than another? And is there any inequity there? Or are you paying people the same, but the people who are getting bonuses or if you have a pay for performance model where you're rewarding some type of commission structure, that may not be set up as equitably as your base pay. So looking at total compensation is really important. Base pay is always where we start, but we have to grow from there. With pay transparency, I like to use this pay scale transparency spectrum. I think they do a really good job about talking about different stages of pay transparency. And one thing that's important is no matter where you are on this scale, I think it's important if you want to move in the direction towards the low, that you have a plan for how to do that, a communication plan. If you're moving all the way from one side to the other, that you're doing that gradually. With this pay transparency spectrum, we have what on the one side. And basically what that means is you're just telling people what they're paid. It's listed on their paycheck. And that's about all they know about the pay in their organization. The second piece is the how. So that's giving them a little more information. You might share some market data and kind of how you've determined their pay. When you get to the where piece on this spectrum, you're right in the middle. You're sharing things like your strategy and some pay ranges, but you're not really going into much more detail about why you pay the way you do. The next piece is the why, and really focusing on the culture and making sure that employees understand not only what they make, but why. And then the last part is the whoa. I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment and we can do another poll. Share the results. So we have about 50% of the people say sort of with a pay strategy and working on it. That is a really good place to be because it's definitely better than the no, we're not even thinking about it. And then the other 50% are in the yes, and we share it openly. And I absolutely love that. The more transparency, I think the better. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So another thing I wanted to share when we talk about pay transparency is that employees are happier if they have more transparent pay. And part of that, and PayScale did a study that showed that 82% of employees are satisfied with lower pay as long as they understand the rationale behind it. So sometimes you might be able to have a strategy where you're just meeting or even lagging the market, but if you explain the reasoning behind that and how that all works within your company, people are generally okay with it as long as they understand the why they're being paid what they are. The other thing I wanted to mention is this whoa, which I think for most people is a little scary, the idea of 100% open salary, but I wanted to talk about a couple companies who have done that. So one of the companies that was really early on in doing open salary was Whole Foods. And the CEO of Whole Foods did this in order to spurn some what he felt like was healthy competition between his employees. So the salary was 100% transparent within the company. It wasn't shared publicly, but with that, it was everybody knew what everyone else was making within the company. And the goal from the CEO was that if people who were making less wanted to make more, they understood what they needed to do, where they needed to be promoted to make more money, and how much that would be. So he felt like it was a goal for them. The other company that does 100% open salary, and they actually share this publicly, is a company called Buffer. There's a really interesting salary calculator they have where you can go on and see the different jobs, and based on the location, see what they're paying people. And they actually have a whole spreadsheet that they share publicly. So their story is really interesting, and I think they're a great example of a way to do 100% open salary and that whoa piece of the spectrum. So a little bit more about pay transparency. We know that greater pay transparency leads to greater pay equity. And as I mentioned, when people feel that their pay is equitable and understand how they're paid, they're more engaged and more satisfied. So at the end of the day, pay equity equals happy and productive employees. Now let's talk about the data piece of the checklist. So this is the part I get the most excited about, where we get to dig into the data. And this, part of what can be challenging getting here is actually collecting all the data and making sure you have all the data you need to actually look at your pay. The data will tell you a story, and I think it's important to have as much data as possible to analyze. Of course, you don't want unnecessary data, but there are some things that I think people need to think about. So when we're looking at pay equity, we often think of gender, but what other demographics are you collecting from your employees to compare? So do you have racial demographics, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, all those different pieces that we're looking at? And it can be really helpful to look at those and not just gender. Then we want to get market data. So one of the things I like to mention about market data is you really do get what you pay for. Often I see HR people looking for data that they can get for free. And what I will tell you about that data is it's not very good. So Glassdoor is an example of a place where you can get free pay data. And what I've found is that some of that data is so old that it nowhere near reflects what people are actually making in those jobs or in those companies. Oftentimes, when minimum wage increases in different states or cities, that data is completely inaccurate because people have been paid more due to those increases. So finding the right source for your data, making sure they have a good collection from your industry is really important. And doing that research can take a little bit of time, but having the best data to use is going to make or break whether your pay equity analysis is effective. Then you want to look at who will analyze the data. So you might have human resources do it. You might have a compensation team, or do you have data analysts within your company, or are you going to hire an outside consultant? This can be helpful if you are a smaller company or just at a company that doesn't have the experts to work on this. And then thinking about how you group the jobs is important also. And one of the things I like to mention that helps lay a good foundation for doing this work is ensuring that you have up-to-date job descriptions. So if you are using outdated job descriptions and you're grouping jobs together, but the actual responsibilities of some of those people have changed, that's not going to be effective when you're grouping the jobs. So just one more time, I wanted to share all of the steps for the checklist. I'm not going to go into any more detail, in the rest of these, but I did talk in quite a bit of detail about the strategy, the market data, and then, collecting that company data as well. Again, to connect with Workvision Consulting, this is the information on our website. You can complete a contact form if you're interested in setting up a meeting to talk about services, or email info@workvisionconsulting.com. And like I said, when I share this presentation, I will share some of the other resources, as well as some of the links for where I got some of the information. So there's some really great links that I will share that have every single pay equity information or laws from every single state. And that was just updated December 2020. So it has all the updated laws per state. And that can be important especially if you operate in multiple states. And I'll just also share some of the other studies that I got the information from. So thank you so much. I'm going to see if we have any questions. I have one question in here, which is, how often should you do a pay equity audit? And that's a really great question. I oftentimes hear people talk about the frequency of the audits, and most commonly I hear people talk about doing a pay equity audit once every year. And I think that's a really good cadence, because when you think about just updates in laws and things like that, yearly is about when you should be looking at it anyways. But I've also heard people say every 6 months, which I think is a little too often. Now, what I do think about the 6-month mark is it's good to assess your employees' pay, which is different than doing a full pay equity audit. But I do think it's good to assess pay increases every 6 months. And the reason for that is if you do your pay increases only once a year, and let's say you come around to that annual mark and there are people who you don't give pay increases to, and then they have to wait a whole nother year, you're likely going to lose that person. We know that when people change jobs, they're most likely to get about a 10 to 20% increase. But when companies increase pay, usually it's closer to around 4 or 5%. And with that, if you're not giving any increases for a year, that would definitely be a reason that someone might think about looking at leaving. And so to answer the overall question though, I think once a year is a great amount of time to do a pay equity audit. The very first audit is going to be the most difficult piece, because it's really laying that groundwork for things like your strategy and really diving into what data you're collecting. But once you do it year over year, it gets easier and easier because you've already laid that foundation. So that's really it can be a little scary if you aren't jumping into it yet, but jump in, do that work, and year after year it's going to get easier. And I don't see any other questions, so thank you so much for everyone who has joined us. If you do have any questions for me following this, you can always reach out via email, as I mentioned, info@workvisionconsulting.com. And I will send this recording out, as well as some of those resources I mentioned. So thank you again, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.